Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this very special pre-Israeli election policy forum. Next week, of course, on Tuesday, the citizens of Israel, some of whom have already gone to the polls around the world, the citizens of Israel are going to the polls for a very consequential election, perhaps one of the most consequential in recent history. I think everyone by now knows that this is an unusual election in many respects. The incumbent Prime Minister, who is now at 10 years direct in office, going for an unprecedented re-election, the creation of an election alternative party, which has brought together for the first time 3 former chiefs of staff, new parties, new formations of parties on all parts of the political spectrum, and as we have seen just in the last few hours, the impact of outside actors, whether it's President Putin in Russia this week, President Trump here in the United States just a couple of weeks ago. This is an important election of a small country in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it is also a political event which has connections and reverberations far beyond Israel's borders. To help explain what the issues are, what the party formations are all about, what the potential outcomes may be, and for our audience, most importantly, what the implications of this election is all about. I'm really delighted to welcome this very knowledgeable, well-informed panel of Israeli political experts. First up is going to be my colleague Ehud Yaari. Ehud just arrived yesterday from Israel. He is our Israel-based Lafer International Fellow, award-winning Middle East commentator for Israel television. Ehud is Israel's best-known and most accomplished interpreter of the Middle East for Israelis, and he helps us understand both sides of the Arab-Israel divide, helps us understand Israeli politics, national security, as well as understanding how Israelis view the world around them. I'm delighted to welcome Ehud back to the Washington Institute. Speaking second via video, direct from Israel, is Tal Shalev. Tal is the chief political correspondent for the leading Israeli web portal Walla News. She's been a news editor at Haaretz, international television reporter for ITV News. Delighted to be able to welcome Tal, who will bring us the latest direct from Israel. There you can see Tal up on your screens. I should say that those who are listening to their C-SPAN audience right now can't see Tal, but she's right there on video to participate in today's event. Parenthetically, if I could ask everyone to please turn your cell phones on mute, because this is being broadcast live on C-SPAN, live on live stream, taped for C-SPAN TV. Feel free to tweet out as much as you like, but please turn your phones on mute. Our third speaker is David Makovsky, our Ziegler Distinguished Fellow, director of our program on Arab-Israel relations. David is the author most recently of this very insightful policy note, which takes a look more broadly at key trends in Israeli politics today. And the basic headline is right there, the center and the right, as opposed to the left and the right, examining Israel's realigned politics. And David, of course, will have a chance to explain what he means when he gets to the podium. Don't read this now. Take it with you. And feel free to spread the news about this with all your friends. You can find a lot more on Israeli political dynamics on the website of the Washington Institute. www.washingtoninstitute.org. You can find the insight of other Washington Institute scholars like Ambassador Ross, Dennis Ross, and Rachel Omari, and other experts who touch on Israel and Israel's relations with its neighbors. But today I'm going to turn directly to my friend Ehud and, to lead off today's panel. Ehud Yaari.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Under strict instructions not to pass 10 or so minutes, I will try to fire some bullets, assuming that the audience is pretty well versed in the goings of the Israeli campaign. So I would like to go beyond the nasty campaign. We have had nasty campaigns in the past. This is perhaps nastier, but I remember a few of them when Shimon Peres had an Arab mother and was accused of having shares in a telecom company, Tadiran, etc., which were no less acrimonious and vicious. These elections are basically one thing. This is a referendum about Bibi Netanyahu. That's what's at stake. This is how the campaign is conducted. This is what the result will tell us about his fate. Probably we are holding this kind of referendum about Bibi, while it's clear to many, not to all, that probably we are coming to the end of the Bibi era because of the charges, the indictment, which is waiting for him around the corner. Bibi himself was planning to retire in 2 years. That was his game plan, and to move to the presidency, replacing President Rivlin when he retires. And for that purpose, his plan was to get Mr. Yair Lapid, then not united with General Gantz, as his foreign minister, securing the votes of his party to move to the president's residence. This plan is no longer possible, but it gives you an indication about the frame of mind of Bibi just before the indictments were announced. In brackets, very carefully, I will say, that when you discuss Bibi in the context of Israeli domestic politics, it's a team. It's Bibi and wife. They act like a team on these issues, not on strategic issues. They act as a team, and it will continue to be like this. This is the way it is, at any rate, in the current campaign. Referendum about Bibi because Bibi has taken over the Likud, which is lost, if you want to put it this way, the liberal wing of the Likud. Almost nobody remains from that wing of the party, the old-style revisionists, the people who came originally from a businessman party called the General Zionists. They are no longer there, either out of politics or somewhere else. This party was swallowed by the Prime Minister, and this is why the future of the Likud party, post-Bibi, is a huge question mark. Rob mentioned that it seems Trump and Putin were trying to assist Bibi in different ways. Others did the same, like Bolsonaro from Brazil, some East European leaders. But most interesting, I'm offering it as an anecdote, most interesting, the Gulf states. Some of the Gulf states, my information, were encouraging the split of the Arab list, the unified Arab list. Because by splitting the Arab list now into two, there may be a possibility that the bigger one of these two parties will be a part of some arrangement with a future coalition if Mr. Gantz and his allies make it to power. That's very clear. That was the reason of the split. They said bye-bye to the Islamists of the Islamist movement. They said bye-bye to the ultra-nationalists, supported by Qatar, who are running now together, barely reaching the minimum bar of 4 seats in the Knesset, and they are getting ready to the possibility that they can play in the Israeli coalition formation process, exacting a price in terms of the Arab minority rights, budgets, etc., etc. They are very clear about this intention. Mr. Gantz' only strength may be harsh, and I apologize, this is the way I see it. Mr. Gantz's only strength is Bibi weaknesses. He failed so far to impress large sectors of the Israeli public opinion. He doesn't present a detailed agenda and is escaping all the time towards generalities, and then you are at difficulty to find what exactly is the difference between the policies that he's offering and the policies that Bibi is pursuing. And the main drive for the blue-white party led by Gantz is the disgust that many Israelis feel now towards their prime minister because of all the charges and the stories and whatever is being printed daily in the media. The timeline is July. There will be a hearing where Bibi's lawyers will be given the opportunity to present to the Attorney General their reservations concerning the draft indictment. And the Attorney General, who used to work for years for Bibi, as secretary of his government, very closely with Bibi, will have to decide whether he have to change some of the clauses of the 3 indictments presented so far. Bibi's intention, although he doesn't speak about it, but we assume, and I think we are on safe, solid ground here, Bibi's plan is to see whether post-elections, if he is entrusted with forming the next coalition, something that President Rivlin would not like to do but may have no choice, his plan is to try and see whether he can change the legislation concerning the immunity law, whether he can introduce what is called the French law. You do not indict a sitting elected official, or down there is also the option of a plea bargain. You retire from politics, we will forgive you. That's on the table. Again, not publicly, not officially, but it is on the table. How serious the charges are? Heated debate in Israel. And I'm not hesitant to share with you, sorry, my own, I'm not a jurist, but to share with you my impression that it's not going to be easy to prove, for example, bribery on the case of the, we call it case 4000, the case of Israeli Telecom Bezek. It's not going to be easy. And a trial like this can take for quite a few years. Because, just to give you one illustration, the defense will bring journalists and politicians and publishers to expose the very tricky relationships that exist between politicians and publishers and journalists, etc., in order to illustrate that Bibi basically acted almost like everybody else. Big question mark. We will not know that before April 9th when we have the elections. Is the whole issue of the submarines and Bibi's share in this company of his cousin here in America. This did not mature yet into an indictment. Now, where are we going? My hunch, no more than that, my hunch that most probably Bibi will be invited by the president to form the new government. In order to get there, it doesn't need necessarily to be the largest party. It's enough if 60 plus members, half the Knesset plus one, recommend him to the president and say that we would be happy to participate in his government. Is he going to get the 60, 61? A lot depends on the threshold, because there are almost half a dozen parties on the right who are saying in different voices that they prefer to go to government with, to coalition with Bibi, who may not necessarily make it to the Knesset. And then you are talking about loss of right-wing votes, which can go easily, can run into hundreds of thousands of votes. Changes the map. So if a guy like the present Minister of the Treasury, Kahlon, doesn't make it, it's a problem for Bibi. If the ex-defense minister, the illustrious Mr. Lieberman, doesn't make it, and his votes are in decline according to all the polls, that's a problem for Bibi. And there are others. I'm not going to go down the list. The main issues that should be the topic of the elections are nowhere. There are no real discussion in these elections about Iranians in Syria, the nuclear deal, Palestinians. Gantz, for example, is not even willing to say the word Palestinian state, lest he will be considered a left-winger. And the left is going bankrupt steadily since Oslo 93. So they are dealing with all sorts of other issues, apart from the personal recriminations and attacks, but do not touch the real issue. I would say that the main issue at stake is the intent of the right to reverse the judicial revolution instigated years ago by Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice Aaron Barak, which allowed the Supreme Court to take position on every issue, overrule Knesset laws, etc. And the lady who is leading this campaign, Ayelet Shaked, the Justice Minister, she is now part of the new right party with her partner, Mr. Bennett, although she is becoming fast the senior partner. That's her agenda. And it's important because if Bibi finally has to go, Ayelet, who was here in the Institute some time ago, Ayelet will rejoin, with or without Bennett, will rejoin the Likud, and she will become a serious contender for the leadership of the party and the premiership. Now, the best outcome of the elections is the option of a grand coalition between Likud and Blue-White, plus Labor, plus others, but mainly between these two major forces. The question is whether Mr. Gantz and his allies, in case Bibi has the lead, will accept to serve in a government headed by him. Mr. Gantz, until very recently, was not excluding this possibility. As we get closer to elections, he's trying to sharpen the pencil, but it's there. And the question is whether they will accept Bibi to be prime minister or will try to trigger an internal battle within the Likud where the different lieutenants of Bibi will be offered to stab him in the back in return for ABC OD. I don't have a good signals as to how they will respond to such a possibility. Oh, sure, some of them really want to replace Bibi as prime minister, but I'm not sure that any one of them can take over the party and lead it towards a grand coalition with Gantz. Politically, strategically, this kind of coalition would probably allow Israel to take more initiative in the context of the conflict with the Palestinians and other issues. I don't see a major departure from the broad lines of the Bibi strategy. If it is going to be a narrow right-wing Bibi-led coalition, and remember, he can stay in power until convicted in the last instance of the Supreme Court, which could take years, legally, if the partners accept that he'll keep serving while he's standing trial. This is the Israeli law. If it is a narrow right-wing coalition, I think the drift towards a more nationalistic approach, the pressure towards taking all sorts of unilateral moves in the West Bank and East Jerusalem will grow, and certainly we will see the attempt to reverse the judicial revolution, as it's called in Israel, of Supreme Court Chief Justice Barak. For the left, and I'm finishing here, for the left wing or center-left coalition led by Barak, they will need, they will need, I wanted Ehud Barak to come back to politics, but he didn't. They didn't allow him. Anyway, for a center-left coalition, they will need probably both defectors from the right-wing bloc, from one or two of the smaller parties, and some assurance, some deal for support by the one-hour party that I mentioned before, which is based on what used to be the Israeli Communist Party. That's people who, in 1948, distributed leaflets all over the West Bank supporting the establishment of a Jewish state, according to the partition. But they're, of course, very critical about the way Israel goes now. So out of these three scenarios, I think the best that Israelis at least should hope for is that they will find a way to work a grand coalition. It was Bibi's preference before the indictment. I told you about Lapid going to the foreign ministry and etc. Only the results, the numbers, will tell us whether it's feasible. And one last point that I have to make is, although I'm wary of the reaction of David Pollock, I would be very, very careful reading the polls in Israel. I'm coming from the media, from the biggest television network in Israel. I see how it's done. I see how it undergoes cosmetic changes before it gets to air. I see how the different pollsters coordinate before they publish the results. And most important, between 20 and 30, maybe 35% of Israelis at this point have no clue how they are going to vote in 5 days. So the pollsters have no clue. They make assumption on how the undecided will break, but it's only assumptions. Thank you.
Very good. All right, Ehud, thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Tal in Israel. Tal, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor, and it was a pleasure to listen to Ehud. And I might be repeating some of the things that he already said, so I apologize in advance. I'll try to weigh in on some additional points. First of all, I want to point out that this week, The Economist had a cover story under the headline King Bibi, which is basically a headline that was already given in May 2012 to the cover story of Time magazine. And looking between these stories is basically the story of Netanyahu and where we stand in this election. And I totally agree with Ehud that this is a referendum on Netanyahu's rule. But this has been the most dramatic and eventful election, both for Netanyahu and both for the country. I'll just summarize quickly some of the things that happened. We had the Zionist Union break up. We had Bennett and Shaked start a new party. We had this big bang in the center left, the blue and white party formation. We had scandals against Benny Gantz. We had an indictment against Netanyahu. We had a lot of fake news, many things that resemble or resonate to things that happened in the U.S. in 2016. But the two most important developments from Netanyahu's point of view were the creation of the Blue and White Party and the alliance between Lapid and Gantz, and the other one, of course, the Attorney General's recommendation to indict him. Netanyahu was very much concerned of these two events, and when he started off the campaign, he was panicking about both of them. And eventually, when we look now back, we see that basically neither of these two major developments did not really impact Netanyahu's situation. First, we had the Gantz and Lapid agreement, which brought in Ya'alon and Ashkenazi, and quite a phenomenon, one should say, that within 3 months, Benny Gantz basically turned into a candidate for being a prime minister. He has this very impressive all-star team behind him. They like to campaign with the slogan, they have more than 117 joint years together. They have 117 years of security experience. So that is aimed at undermining what is one of Netanyahu's cards, and that is Mr. Security. And Benny Gantz also got, when he started out, phenomenal approval ratings. He was the first person in years who actually was polled as suitable and got close to Netanyahu on the question of how suitable is someone to be prime minister. So for the first time, one should say, there was a real alternative for Netanyahu. But the Blue and White Party didn't hurt Netanyahu. They were part of the idea was to create a center-right party, and that's why they brought in many right-wing elements, Ya'alon, who brought in other players who are very right-wing. It didn't hurt Netanyahu on the right. Basically, most of the votes, I guess, probably 90% of the votes that are going to blue and white are from the center-left bloc anyway, and they didn't really succeed to move votes from the right. The other thing also that happened was the Attorney General, the Attorney General's 3 indictment recommendations, and that also went by like a brush on the shoulder of Bibi. And the the thing is that Netanyahu is probably stronger than ever. Many Israelis, and especially his base is very, very admiring, and he's willing to forgive him for the corruption, and is willing to buy his narrative, and has a very low trust in media and in the law enforcement bodies after hearing basically 3 years of constant incitement against them. And he also had a very big difference between 2015 and 2019, and that was the Trump card. I believe that the Trump card is extremely important in understanding why Netanyahu is still so strong, despite the fact that he might be about to go to jail, as Ehud explained, because Trump gave Netanyahu for the first time basically a real diplomatic legacy. Up until the Trump election, up until Trump arrived at the White House, basically Netanyahu had 8 years with the Obama administration, which basically we can define as they ended with a status quo. President Obama did not establish a Palestinian state, as Netanyahu warned time and again, and Netanyahu, for his part, did not annex any territory of Israel, as his right-wing base would like him to. He also failed with his battle against the Iran deal during the Obama years. And then comes Donald Trump and basically gives Netanyahu 3 very major diplomatic gestures or moves in a row, and he actually gives Netanyahu something that he will go down in history for. The embassy and the Golan Heights for sure. The Iran deal, I guess we'll have to wait and see where he goes down in history on that. But from the Israeli public's point of view, which generally, basically, the Israeli public is much more favorable of Trump than, I guess, anywhere in the world. Trump is more popular here than anywhere in the world. But for the first time, Netanyahu has a real diplomatic legacy to present to the public. And it comes along with, as Ehud mentioned, also the Putin card, the relationship. There's a reason that Netanyahu is tampering this relationship with Putin. And for many Israelis, his diplomatic skills now, and the fact that he is one of the longest serving leaders in the world, and also one of the more respected leaders in the world, I think, and the change that the Trump administration has brought to the whole vibe around Israel, the fact that we don't have on a daily basis a State Department announcement denouncing the settlements, and Netanyahu is not constantly fighting with the United States, but on the contrary, he has his best friend in the United States. This gives a very strong card for him, for his base. And you hear many people, by the way, even people that didn't vote for Netanyahu in 2015 and never voted for him, ever say, well, Bibi, he's a different league, and there's no way that Benny Gantz can pick up the phone to Donald Trump and pick up the phone to Putin just like Bibi does. So we feel safe if Bibi is there, and Gantz is inexperienced. So that's one of the reasons that Netanyahu wasn't harmed. Another one of the reasons that Netanyahu wasn't really harmed is that Netanyahu has been running a brilliant campaign. It's been vicious, it's been nasty, it's been very low, it's been criticized and denounced for many rude and dirty tricks. But it's been a good and effective campaign, and it works very good. The Gantz campaign, the blue and white campaign, first of all, had about 2 to 3 weeks in which they were kind of stumbling and they were trying to learn how to work together. And it's less effective, less direct. It takes them much longer to react to events. So I think that has been very crucial. But we are approaching the final days, and the campaigning is almost over. I think as we speak, the TV stations are publishing their last polls, and I totally agree with Ehud that Israelis do Israeli polls. I hear from many of the American pollsters who work here in Israel, they're shocked at how many polls we have and how unprofessional they are. They give the journalists much to talk about. They kind of set the momentum, but they are not necessarily credible. And we should always remember that the polls were wrong in 2015 in Israel, and the polls were widely wrong in 2016 in the U.S. and in the Brexit. So the polls should be taken with very limited advantage. So again, I agree also with Ehud, that it's all open, and while the fight is between the main fight and the main battle is between Gantz and Netanyahu, it will be defined, and the final victor of them both will only be defined by the small parties because it's about the blocks. And even then, only then will the games begin. But what we are seeing now is that Netanyahu is in kind of a dilemma in the final stretch. We're 4 or 5 days away from the elections. And the blue and white party, Gantz and Lapid, are around campaigning that they need to be the biggest party. They need to be the largest party, even though that is not true. It won't by law, it won't necessarily help them if they do not have a majority of the 120 elected lawmakers. But they're campaigning that they need to be the largest party. The strategy behind that says that if they succeed to defeat Netanyahu by a wide margin over 5 seats, it will create such a aftershock in the Israeli political system, because it will be the first time in a decade that someone actually beats and defeats Netanyahu. So they're playing on that. And so they're trying to open a gap from Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is trying to close, doesn't want that gap to open. But on the other hand, the larger Netanyahu gets, the smaller the parties on the margins, the smaller parties that he wants to build his coalition with, they get smaller, and many right-wing votes can go down the drain. So basically, we haven't seen Netanyahu launch a Gewalt campaign yet in its full power. He hasn't yet started what we call drinking with a straw the mandates from the other parties. By the way, Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid are out in the open saying that voters of Meretz and Labor voters should vote for them because that's the way to replace the government, even though that's not true. That's just not the system. So it's going to be very interesting until the last minute, and it's also going to be not only about what the results will be on the 9th of April at 10 o'clock when we get the exit polls. It will actually be only because we're talking about very small parties which are within the margin of error of 10,000 or 15,000 votes to pass the threshold. We might be waiting 36 hours until we get the final votes called, really to know what the situation is, and even then we will not necessarily know who the winner is. Just a few things I think should be pointed out for the day after. First of all, there's a new player in the block, a new kid on the block, who is changing all of the traditional block calculations that we are used to making, and that is Moshe Feiglin, who is leading a right-wing, very liberal party called Zehut, in English, Identity. Moshe Feiglin was, in the past, Netanyahu's worst nightmare in the Likud. But he's posed, and Netanyahu basically spent 4 years between 2009 and 2013 to try and kick him out of the Likud. So he did, but now Feiglin is back in a different form, and he's extremely popular. He presents, the popular part about him is that he's supporting and calling for legalization of pot, which is very popular here in Israel. And the other aspects of his ideology are a very harsh libertarian, strong capitalist, ultra-strong capitalist agenda on the economic side, and I would say a messianic approach, very radical right-wing messianic approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the pot smoke makes him very, very popular, and he will change the traditional bloc divide, because Netanyahu will try and do everything to keep him out of the coalition. It's a very, very radical player that he does not want in the coalition. The other thing that could happen the day after the election, or 2 days after the election, is if President Trump presents his peace plan or starts talking about peace again, that will play into the Israeli political mess in a very dramatic way, I guess. And it could make Netanyahu's job, if he wins and if he gets the recommendation from the president, it will make his job, his goal, his first goal, his initial goal to try and form a right-wing government, very difficult. Another thing that will happen the day after the election is that we will start seeing investigation materials published in the media. Netanyahu was very wise to ask the Attorney General not to pass the investigation materials from his investigations to the other lawyers who are representing other people or other people who are accused or are going to be accused in his investigations. He asked the Attorney General not to transfer the material till after the election because he knows that things are going to come out there that are going to be very embarrassing. So, for instance, this week, Ehud's channel, Channel 12, had an expose. It had a story about it basically had a document which was written by Sarah Netanyahu in 2013, in which she basically is giving directions and directing and ordering someone, we don't know who he is, it's in her handwriting, how to defame and to basically lead a defamation campaign against Naftali Bennett. From my understanding, inside the materials, there might be many, many more embarrassing things like this that could make Netanyahu's job of forming a coalition also a bit more complicated. And there is this new investigation about which kind of links Netanyahu to the submarine affair and his relationship and his shareholding with his cousin, which it probably will, it's not an investigation yet. At the moment, it's only in a preliminary stage, but it appears it's going to turn into a full-scale investigation. And if there's a link between Netanyahu and the submarine affair, it's a totally different story than the one we've been talking about in the past with the other three files. Last thing is that Netanyahu is very concerned about what's going to happen the day after at President Rivlin. And basically, he's been waging a very negative campaign trying to force Rivlin to say that he will be giving him the task to form the government and he will be ignoring the legal processes against Netanyahu. By law, the law is very vague who Rivlin needs to give the ticket to. The law says that he needs to give it to the candidate that has the highest chances of forming a new government. And tradition says that he gives it to the candidate that can rally up 61, a majority of the 120 elected lawmakers. But what happens if you're at 60-60? And what happens if nobody succeeds to get a majority? Then Rivlin might have consultations and maybe he will decide for another course of action. And maybe he will decide that the person who won the largest party is the one who will get the chance. Netanyahu and Rivlin have a very, very bad relationship. And Netanyahu is very much concerned about this. Last October, he went so far to accuse Rivlin of cooperating and conspiring with another Likud member, Gideon Sa'ar, to basically oust Netanyahu after the election and put some other Likudnik instead of Netanyahu. I don't see that happening. It's probably much in Netanyahu's mind, but he is definitely not assured. So he definitely doesn't want Rivlin to have a reason to give it to Benny Gantz. He really wants to have it for himself. And that's where I'm at.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tal. Very useful, very insightful. Now we'll turn to David Makovsky. David.
Thank you, Rob. You can hear me in the back okay? Okay, my colleagues have done a really great job in trying to give you a lay of the land. So I'm going to try to hit on a few other points. And I want to thank my research assistant, Basha Rosenbaum, and Lexi Shear, my intern, who helped put this together just so you will have this at your fingertips. And Rob mentioned the policy note. Feel free to pick up on your way out if you haven't taken it already. But I think, and I would agree with what certainly with Ehud and Tal would said about Israeli polls, to take them certainly with more than a grain of salt. But I do think it is interesting to have a context here. Look, on the surface, this seems like almost a Seinfeld election in the sense that it's not about a policy decision. But that's not unique to Israel, and it's not unique to this election. It's not about what do you do with Hamas tomorrow or housing prices tomorrow. It is a referendum, as my colleague said, on Netanyahu's leadership. But I would say not to be fooled, that this is, yes, one of Israel's dirtiest elections. It's not, in history, as Ehud pointed out, there have been others. But I think what's interesting here is the subtext. And Ehud may be right that maybe 25% haven't decided, but I think it's a narrower, I don't know if we disagree on this, Ehud, but a subset about the blocks. Because what you've heard from my colleagues is about the blocks. It's not just about which party is the most, but who gets to 61? Who could cobble together enough of these parties to have a bare majority in a 120-member Knesset? So I think here, if you think of it that way, then what you really see is that I would argue the number of people that could actually go from the center left, center right, or center right to the center, maybe it's 10%. And that the whole is about reaching that very narrow subtext. It's about trying to reach emotional pitches for some of these waivers. And you'll see this with the way the campaign has gone. So it doesn't mean the 90% don't have a view. I would just argue in terms of the blocks, they're locked in. They might have disagreements. Do they vote for Labor or blue-white? Do they vote for Likud or Bennett? But there's not that many waivers from the two big blocks. And Tal mentioned Feiglin, this crazy hybrid party of a libertarian who wants to build the third temple. Of course, there is such a thing as two mosques that are there, so you blow them up. Well, you have World War III. He doesn't raise that. But he's one of the only people who's actually moving people from block to block. So I would say the broader point is that most people are locked in on the philosophy in terms of they either feel comfortable on the right and they feel comfortable on the center. What is striking, though, and here's the three things I want to accomplish with this talk. What are the conceptual divide between center and right? A couple observations on the elections, and what does it mean for the United States the day after? So I would just say in terms of the first point of the conceptual differences, first is you have to talk about the decline of the left. In 1992, Labor and Meretz together were at 56 seats. Now, according to one of the latest reputable polls, they're at 19. You could argue 18, 17, but it's nowhere near 56. Why has the left been in decline? I think it started with the Second Intifada. I mean, in the 90s, people forget, but there were polls, 65% of Israelis thought a two-state solution was at hand. 55% thought it was justified to have two states. But the Second Intifada, the rockets after disengagement from Gaza and Lebanon and Gaza, and then 3 wars with Hamas in Gaza from 2008, December 2008, through 2014, have all taken a toll. And so the big mega story in Israel, I think, in a certain way, has been the decline of the left. So what does the center and the right stand for? What are their foundational principles, thinking, outlook? What demographics do they count on? I would just say on the right, Netanyahu has indeed refashioned the Likud. A lot of the more liberal elements of the Likud left after the Gaza disengagement, went to the center party of Kadima, and both now it is definitely his Likud. I would say one of the things he's done is he's taken advantage of the demography. And in 1998, 52% of Israelis identified as secular. In 2018, 47%, 5% drop. According to Rivlin in 2015, if you look at the first grade of Israel in 2015, only 38% of first graders are part of secular families. There's been a demographic shift, and it has enabled the Likud to broaden what I would call the coalition of the outsiders. That's something Begin started in 77. Traditionalists, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, settlers, post-state immigrants, Mizrahim, who are also traditionalists and also came after the state. So he's broadened that group, and the demographics has been cutting for him. Also, Netanyahu very much identified an antagonism to an old elite that he identified as the courts, that they were secular, liberal, And he is like a wedge issue, has gone after that sense of resentment and grievance, and has talked about, setting back, as Ehud pointed out, the Aaron Barak kind of judicial revolution to liberalize. Another kind of point of his worldview, which we've seen in this campaign in spades, is casting aspersions on those insufficiently skeptical of Arab intentions. The idea that you could take 3 chiefs of staff and saying they're left wing, that they have a hidden agenda, it might seem laughable, but then when you look at the polls and say the all-time low in the number of blocks on the center left was 53, and with 3 chiefs of staff and a Mandelblit report on 3 allegations of corruption, including bribery, it's only moved the needle 5 seats. 3 chiefs of staff, 3 counts of corruption, and according to the polls now, 5. Could it change? According to Haaretz, it's back to 53. Anyway, we'll have to see. But that's been another premise. And finally, I would say another premise has been, a couple more. One is the ability of Netanyahu to de-link the Palestinian issue from broader kind of some rapprochement with Sunni Arab states in the Gulf. That has been a theme of his. I could do outreach to Asia, with China and India. They're amoral. That they all they want is money and commerce. I can do this. I could do the outreach to Africa. The Palestinian issue is marginal. And as was mentioned before, another piece of his kind of worldview: don't alienate Trump, whatever it takes. And we could talk about that later. And finally, the key point is it's okay to build outside the blocks, outside of the settlement blocks, inside the barrier. There are now 105,000 settlers outside the barrier. Gaza was 8,500. This is 105,000 and growing. And I go through more numbers later. I just want to move on. I don't want to take up too much time. So what has been the premise of the center? Peace is not attainable now. But the status quo is not good either, because what's not at stake is peace, but what is at stake is Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state. That is the central idea of the center, in my view. Therefore, don't settle outside the barrier, because you don't want Bosnia. You don't want a situation that you cannot separate in the future. You want to maintain the viability of 2 states, even if you can't do it tomorrow. So where does that leave us? And here, I just want to deal with the international piece here, and it deals with the observations on the election. One is the power of incumbency, and not just incumbency, but the ability of Netanyahu as an incumbent to attract other incumbents on his behalf. Some will call them enablers, but he has been like a maestro at a piano board, playing this, knowing where to go, who to go to, how to go to. Go to Trump, get a declaration of annexation on the Golan Heights. Go to Putin today and demonstrate that you have this unique relationship, which is needed, which is popular in Israel because you have over 1 million Russian immigrants, and about who's going to handle Syria, given the Iran issue. Putin's in charge. You got to have a relationship with Putin. And that doesn't hurt him. Try to drink, in the words of Tal with the straw, the voters of Mr. Lieberman, who has traditionally had a lot of those Russian immigrants, although he's having a harder time with the second-generation Russians. Hard to be an immigration party 30 years after an immigration, because these people feel Israelis. And he's also been effective in getting summits, even with leaders from Greece and Cyprus, to talk about a pipeline to Italy, even though there's a lot of issues left over. Pompeo came and blessed it. So there are a lot of leaders that seem to very much the timing to help Mr. Netanyahu, although they will deny that that's their intention. And finally, the Warsaw meeting of Arab Gulf leaders was also so helpful to him. And the leader of Brazil, Netanyahu, went to Brazil. Now the leader of Brazil came to Israel. So that is something an incumbent has. Yes, I agree that Gantz has run a lackluster campaign, but it's very hard to compete with an incumbent who has powerful friends abroad who want to see him get reelected. Now, I will just say, just about the disciplined campaign of Netanyahu. It's been vicious, under the belt, but it's been disciplined. It's been disciplined in the sense that he's tried to hit one overarching theme, that Gantz doesn't have the experience to be prime minister, but he's had his surrogates not just question his experience. They kept using, he's not baked, but they're questioning his basic competence, that he's not stable. But he's been disciplined at hitting one overarching theme, and the other side has not been. The final point, like I said, there is drama left in this election because small parties, they're more on the right than on the center. These parties could kind of fall under the electoral threshold of 3.25%. It would be ironic. Mr. Lieberman was the one who raised the threshold to keep some of the Arab parties out. Now he might be the victim of the very rule that he installed in 2015. The final point section I just want to make is the issue of what does this mean after the election? Where does it go? Where does it mean? And here I think and what does it mean for the Trump peace plan for the United States? I think that any scenario you slice it, it doesn't look good for the Trump peace plan, I must say. Because, look, if Gantz does win and he pulls this out somehow, he's not going to want a plan that has a high risk of failure. Abbas says he's already against it. He will want to say, hey, you've been able to craft something with Netanyahu for 2.5 years. Sit with me. I want something that's got a very high probability of success because this is central to me. So I think that puts it on hold. Now, if the right wins, they will be the most nervous about this peace plan. And he will be more beholden to the right than he would be normally because of the indictment. With the legal cloud he's under, he will not want to anger them, and not unless he can guarantee them the following, which is if you go for this peace plan and Abbas says no, then you start annexing parts of the West Bank in the wake of Abbas saying no. That sets the predicate. That's Bibi's kind of way, which is don't jump ahead of Trump, don't jam him, but talk about what flows from it in the aftermath of a failure. But Trump isn't there to fail, and if he feels he might fail, I know this is Rob's view, that he will not put it forward at all. We'll see. But clearly the right is going to want some sort of a trophy for being with him. And they will want some sort of annexation. And what he wants is a French law that means you cannot indict a sitting prime minister, and that there will be an overriding law that the courts will have actually no say in overriding legislation in the current session. So is there a trade-off here? A French law, an overriding law in return for annexing Ma'ale Adumim or something like that? We shall see. Could we all be surprised by a unity government between Netanyahu and Gantz? Anything is possible, of course. I think the center, though, will be very hard-pressed to join this. Gantz has, said over and over again, the public doesn't believe Gantz, by the way, but according to the polls, but that he's not going to join Netanyahu, because certainly if there's a hearing, which is supposed to be in July, and a formal indictment, he's going to be the first to jump ship. These are people who are united against the referendum on Netanyahu. Are they going to prop him up? I tend to think Netanyahu will think sequentially, which goes like this. I would like to lock in the right first and foremost. That's the way I've done it in every other election. I want to lock in my base. The base is critical for him. Certainly if he's under pressure, he'll want that. He won't be able to totally trust the right. Bennett, Lieberman, these people hate him. He knows that. He knows that. They know that he knows that he knows that they know. But the point is that if he could lock in this French law, I think that would be good. But he doesn't want to have Bennett as his defense minister, who's to his right, and he doesn't trust Bennett at all. So what about a sequential approach, which says, first lock in the right. Then I have my base, but I can't fully trust them. But I will leave open the defense ministry and maybe the foreign ministry. So the door is open to Gantz down the road. This way I don't have to give Bennett the defense portfolio or the foreign ministry portfolio. I kind of wink at the center that I'm trying to be a big tent guy. And maybe after my hearing, and I've got the French law anyway, I will make the case to them quietly, and their supporters maybe, some of them will make the case, we got to save the country for Israel's democratic future, and they will believe that it's better to be inside the tent than outside it. I realize there's a lot of assumptions here. I'm always worried when we have more assumptions, but I think that these are three scenarios to think about. What I think is the least problem, the least likely, is that Netanyahu quits. I think if he's going to do a plea bargain, he's better off to do it from the outside than the inside. He's better off to do it inside as a government official than on the outside. You could quit once, as one of the top Likud people say, which he did in '99. It's hard to quit twice. I don't think he quits. I think he stays at it. But this is an election like all other elections. We're on the eve of Passover, so how is this election different than all other elections? That is the issue of the legal cloud that Netanyahu is facing that I think are going to impact the calculations in the post-election period. So stay tuned, put the tray tables in the upright positions, and buckle your seatbelt. I think there's turbulence ahead. Thank you all very much.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, David. I think this last hour has been quite an immersion course in the Israeli political system and the upcoming elections. Let me just pose a couple of quick questions and then turn the floor over to you for your questions. First, Ehud, in some previous elections, the Palestinians, not that they had a vote, but they tried to affect the outcome. In this election, are Palestinians trying to affect the outcome in any way?
I don't see any real effort by the PA to have an impact on elections, partially because they know that their ability to influence the way in which Israelis are voting is very limited. I think it's very interesting that Mr. Yahya Sinwar of Hamas saw fit to reach a sort of arrangement with Bibi closer to elections, and this is a contribution to Bibi's campaign, because he's saying, implying to the public, you've heard Mr. Bennett, you have heard Mr. Lieberman, all these guys who wanted to go and send our kids in uniform into Gaza. I did better. I used the Air Force, I applied some pressure, I got a deal, it's going to be quiet. And I'm sure Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, who speaks fluent Hebrew and did a degree in the many years he sat in Israeli prison, I'm sure the first thing he does every morning is read the Israeli press and listen to Israeli television. He knows the scene.
Thank you. David, Tal, one option which didn't come up on the potential set of options is not just a tie, but what is the chance that President Rivlin says you need to do another election sometime in the not too distant future? Is this just a round one of 2019's elections?
Look, if it's 60-60, then he will. I think will want to play out that. There's this enmity with him and Netanyahu. Is it going to be fully 60-60? Can he count on the Arab parties to fully, to actually back Gantz? He might want to, if it's a tie, I think he could let Netanyahu go first and fail. The Gantz strategy was always, if he had 61, to tell, it seems to me, the ultra-Orthodox, listen, we know Netanyahu's your first choice, but as Zvulun Hammer, one of the leaders of the religious party, said, you promised to follow the Likud in the government, you didn't promise to follow them in the opposition. So he was always, I think, counting on flipping the religious parties if there was no pathway. But I'm just not sure it'll be a full 60-60 because some of the 60 for Gantz will be the Arab parties who said they have no intention of actually joining the coalition. So I don't know. I'm dubious. But what I am concerned about, Rob, your point, is given Netanyahu's legal situation, this could be something we've never seen before. A, there could be protracted limbo. B, if Netanyahu is forced out at a certain point, if he doesn't succeed with this French law and the override provision, then I wonder if there's going to be another election within a year. I think that could be a real possibility.
Tal, let me ask you, since you're so close to this, can you give us a little sense or a little taste of how this joint leadership of blue and white has been running. Lapid, Gantz, Ashkenazi, Ya'alon. Has this been a cohesive team?
Well, no. When you put 4 men in a room and 3 of them were former IDF chiefs of staffs, it's complicated. And it's been complicated for them. I think that generally outside they're trying to project that they're all in the same line. But one of the incidents that has rocked basically Gantz's campaign is the fact that he has had 3 series of leaked tapes from intimate discussions he held, closed door discussions he held. And one of these leaked tapes, you can hear him basically talking about his partners, how he doesn't have any trust in them, how he doesn't, he had some criticism there about Gabi Ashkenazi. Gantz is not necessarily I think between the 3 of them, and Ehud would probably be wiser than me on this, but Gantz is not the senior between the 3 of them. I think Ya'alon and Ashkenazi are considered more senior. They were also at some points in charge of him, his commanders. So at least, and that makes it complicated. It also makes it complicated that Gabi Ashkenazi, and it makes it complicated that Yair Lapid did give up his dream of being prime minister temporarily, but there's a lot of pressure on him in the past few days to cancel the rotation agreement. The Labour Party is campaigning very, very strong against the rotation agreement, and there's a lot of pressure there to cancel the rotation agreement. And it's very possible that Gantz himself also asked to cancel the rotation agreement, but Lapid won't. Then you have the question of Gabi Ashkenazi, which is a very delicate question. Gabi Ashkenazi joined the party like basically at the last minute, the night before. Gabi Ashkenazi, just like Benny Gantz, was courted by everyone in the political system, but he had conditions and he took his time, and he wanted to be sure that he has a team that will bring a change in the government. So it took him time, and he only joined last when it was clear that Benny Gantz was leading. But there's something about Gabi Ashkenazi's natural charisma. Gabi Ashkenazi also has a lot of dirt and a lot of scandals in the past that are not necessarily going to help him, weren't supposed to help him reach the top. But you can see by the public reaction to Gabi Ashkenazi, it's totally different than the public reaction to Benny Gantz. There's something about the way Gabi Ashkenazi connects to people that Benny Gantz doesn't. Also, Benny Gantz by himself has had, besides these incidents with these tapes, which kind of nobody really knows what's going on with these tapes that keep up coming out with quite embarrassing statements. He also had a series of bad media moves, and it's not clear that everyone there at the Blue and White Party actually really believe that he is the most suitable of the 4 to be the prime minister, but at least that's what they saw in the polls when they started out, so that's where they're going now. I can tell you that if they lose, it's going to be, we political reporters assume that it's going to be a lot of fun, because we're going to have all of this ego basically breaking apart. I don't see a way that we see these 3 very senior top generals just be part of the opposition. So if they don't win, it's going to be very, very interesting. By the way, just like it's going to be really, really interesting if Netanyahu suffers from some surprise defeat. As we were speaking, by the way, 2 polls came out in the TV. One of them showed, just to show you what's going on here. So one poll on Channel 12 showed that Gantz is leading by 4 seats, and the other poll showed that the Likud was leading from 1 seat, and each one of them had different block calculations. So it's going to be incognito till the end, and it seems it's about, basically there's a tie here, which we won't really know, and it's a statistic tie. There's so many options that are statistic options when we're analyzing these polls that really, I think we should be preparing also for some surprises, even in the election results themselves.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. All right, let me turn the floor over to you. If you can be kind enough when you get the mic to identify yourself and then identify to whom specifically you want to ask a question. Let's not ask all three of our panelists to offer their views on your question. So Ricky Goldstein, then Bob Friedman here. Go ahead, just speak right into it.
Ricky Goldstein, Human Rights Watch. You all mentioned how devoid this campaign has been of issues, but one issue you mentioned was the Supreme Court and Ayelet Shaked's using that as a kind of a mobilizing issue. How much does, weakening the Supreme Court resonate with Israeli voters? Why would that be a good issue to work? Is it perceived as being pro-Palestinian? Why is that an issue that she's picked up? And then my second question is on the nation-state law, which none of you mentioned. How much is that playing in the in this campaign? The Druze vote, is it something that's mobilizing right-wing voters? Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to take this? Ehud, you want to go first?
About the nation law. It's no longer, it is there, but it's no longer a major topic of conversation. I believe that it will be at one point reviewed. Depends on the kind of coalition that we see, whether they have to add something or balance it with another law. That's one thing. About the Supreme Court and the judicial system, Ayelet was very impressive as a politician, coming from high-tech. Ayelet says that the judicial authorities have robbed the executive branch of much of its power. The government cannot function. When a minister cannot appoint his own legal advisor to tell him right or wrong, but has to get something from the Attorney General's office, etc., it doesn't work. When the government passes legislation or the parliament passes legislation and it's overruled by the Supreme Court, well, these people were elected by the people. So maybe it should be brought to them again, even after the Supreme Court. This resonates with, I can't tell you if it's the majority of Israelis or not, but with many Israelis, including a lot of people who are Bibi's enemies. A lot of people, top experts, top legal experts, etc. So there is an issue there which is serious. As I said before, I believe if we are going to see a narrow right-wing coalition, you will see an assault led by Ayelet against the judicial revolution, also as part of her campaign to rejoin the Likud and fight for the leadership there.
I'll just say briefly, I think the last point that Ehud made, I think, look, it's coming from different angles. There's some people who think the nature of Israel is to take minor offenses and criminalize them in such a way that these should be administrative offenses and not criminal offenses, and that there needed to be some judicial reform. That's one thing that might resonate with small business people, for example. Then the settlers come at it from a totally different way. They just don't want the Palestinians to have access to the judicial system to dispute land purchases and things like that. And they would like retroactive justification for outposts. So those are two different constituencies. What Shaked's success has been is to try to merge people's sense of grievance and resentment with the court judicial overreach, I think, on more on the day-to-day things that affect the business people, and to turn that into something broader. I would say that. And on the nation state, and I'm glad, Ricky, you pointed it out, because, I mean, remember, Gantz's first meeting was with the Druze, where he said that he wants to amend the nation state law. And so I tend to believe he's serious about it. I mean, Netanyahu, when he's asked, and he doesn't, people don't get to ask him questions, because except for now that he's running in an election in this last week, he stays away from the media for 4 years. This was not the Netanyahu of the 90s who was doing interviews all the time. Whenever but if someone could stick a microphone to him, he goes, I'm all for individual civil rights. It's about group rights. But why doesn't the nation state law enshrine the individual rights issues. Israel has other basic laws that do. This would be an easy thing to do if he wanted, but he didn't put it in that original bill. So I tend to think the law will be either, if in review, it'll either be rejected or it'll be amended.
Bob Friedman on my right.
Thank you, Bob. Bob Friedman from Johns Hopkins. It's going to be a close election, and Tal had mentioned that in her last comments. I'm surprised, given the fact that 2 missiles were aimed at Tel Aviv, and there's been constant attacks on the border around Gaza. Is this not finally likely to shift some of the votes of the people who traditionally voted for Likud, maybe over to Kahol V'Lavan? And might that be enough to swing the election?
What's the impact of the Hamas firings?
I think the majority of the Israeli public, including the majority in the envelope of Gaza, as we call it, the villages, the kibbutzim, the townlets there, understand the policy. They understand the policy. They are not seeking now a major campaign in Gaza. And if Bibi can bring a quiet through a deal with the Qataris and the UN envoy, etc., and pacify the situation again, like it was 3 years after the last operation, 2014, people will accept it. And there is no... Mr. Gantz is not offering a different option. But the Israelis understand, and I'll conclude with that, the Israelis understand Bibi's policy. Wear them down. They don't want to make a deal. They do not want to make a deal, neither PA nor Gaza. We wear them down. It takes time. We don't go for a decision tomorrow. And in the meantime, we open up a pivot to Asia. He gets letters from Modi in India in Hebrew. We go to Latin America. I went with him. Why did we go to Chad? Well, okay, we are going to help a little on the Sahel, but it's mainly a French game. We need Chad and the rest of them to fly direct to Latin America and promote business and relations. So, and then the Saudi Arab states, etc., which was referred to by David. The general public understands what he's doing, each, of course, in his own terms. But people see the logic of the policy, whether they can articulate it or not. And it goes also for the situation in Gaza. The 2 missiles to Tel Aviv were accepted by Israeli military intel as a mistake, because maintenance is not so good, and those missiles are improvised. It's not standard missiles that we're firing.
Can I just add to Bob for real briefly that, look, Netanyahu said to a member of Knesset, he said, I've cracked the DNA of the average Israeli, which is they want us to talk tough, but be very careful about committing ground forces. And I think, except for the tunnels in 2014 for 2 kilometers, whatever it was, this is the only prime minister that has never authorized a ground incursion. He said this morning to Khan Radio, he said, I want to stay out of unnecessary wars. This doesn't sound necessarily like what a Likud bravado would be like. But there's no constituency, really, very little constituency, to do a ground incursion in Gaza. Both him and the generals favor actually a containment approach to Gaza. Is there a difference between them? I think the difference might be that the generals would say, let's do more on the humanitarian side. If you caught Netanyahu alone in a private room over a martini, I think he would agree with that. But he feels his base isn't ready for that right now. But they both, neither of them want a ground incursion. They're both risk averse in that regard. And so to me, that he went public and said no unnecessary wars, that reflects that he feels he knows where his base is at.
Can I ask you about his base? I mean, if you look at the chart that you distributed, one thing, among others, that stands out is remarkable consistency. Likud gets 28, 29, 30 seats.
Right.
No more,
right.
No less.
That's right.
For years on end. Right. You said earlier that this has become Netanyahu's Likud.
Yeah.
another analysis of the Likud is that Netanyahu is also the left wing of the Likud, that there is nobody further to the left of him in the sense that that he defines as far as the Likud could conceivably go in terms of Palestinian sets of issues. So elsewhere in the Likud, is the Likud a Netanyahu party in the sense of reflecting that view? Or is the Likud an annexationist party more in the Bennett point of view? Does Bibi's weakness bring out that trend even more within the Likud?
My view, and Ehud and Tal might feel differently. I personally believe that there's the rhetorical view of, oh, sure, we should annex everything, and because they are competing with Bennett and other right-wing parties. But when Netanyahu lays down the law to them in Knesset faction meetings or wherever he communicates with them and says, I need America on my side, I need Trump on my side, and this is not good for us. That gives, the U.S. opposition gives him a reason to push back on some of these people. And at the end, they defer to him. They do see him as the rainmaker of the Likud, and they do not push back. Now, what if the U.S. gives a different signal? After the Golan annexation, people said, well, what if Trump signaled something else? I don't think he will now, but while the plan is still a potential, what happens if the plan fails? That is going to be an interesting test. Where will the U.S. stand there? Because his ability to push back on them is always based on where the United States is. So if the U.S. position shifts, then his ability to push back is weakened. I don't think they ever will take him on head on as long as he's running it. And that's where, I don't know if Ehud and I have a subtle disagreement. I think he actually agrees. But this is an important statistic to remember. In 71 years of either Cherut, which was the forerunner of the Likud, or Gachal, part of that thing, which Cherut was a part of that. But say Cherut or Likud, 71 years, 4 leaders. 4 leaders, that's it. They don't push out their leaders. They just don't. That's not their DNA. So I don't think Bibi's going to have a problem. I tend to think if he loses, he stays in the opposition. But he is still, he is the meal ticket, and I don't think that's going to shift so fast.
Tal, any comment about internal Likud politics?
So there was an interesting point to point out into this whole discussion about the Likud is 2 things. A is that the Likud MKs are much more right-wing than the Likud voters because of the settler lobby. So you see a very strong ideological part of the Likud, which is basically there because of the very strong settler lobby in the Likud. And when you look at the voters, they are less right-wing, because if they were so right-wing, they wouldn't be voting for the Likud. They would be voting perhaps for other right-wing parties. That's A. But B, what happened in the last primary, and this is a process that we don't know how to predict how this is going to influence the Likud, but what happened in the past 7 years since the social protest of 2011 is that a group of liberal Tel Aviv residents, not necessarily Likud voters, decided that the only way they can actually influence the system and actually make things cheaper here is to join the Likud and use their democratic right to try and influence the Likud from within and to try to influence the party's ideology. And they kind of went to this mass membership move, which basically brought probably about somewhere, we don't really know exactly how much, but somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 members inside the Likud. And the Netanyahu and many senior Likud members were trying to fight them in many ways and trying to disqualify them, saying that that they are enemies and they're leftists who are trying to take over the party. But they couldn't, because essentially the Likud is a democratic party, so they just couldn't go on a witch hunt after all of these 5,000 new members and see exactly who they voted for in the previous elections. And this group, which are called the New Likudniks, was very, very successful in the last election. they didn't get one of their own candidates inside the list, but they made several deals with several senior Likud ministers, and they basically, for instance, they're the reason that Yuli Edelstein and Israel Katz, number 1 and number 2 on the Likud list, they're there because they got about 2,000 votes from new Likudniks, which ranked them over other people in the Likud. And the nobody really predicted nobody knew how much influence and how much power they had, but after the election, it's clear that they do have power. Not necessarily they can keep this power, but it means that they have at least 10 people or 8 people on the current Likud list who they are supporting and who were elected by their vote. So they're trying to kind of, balance the settler lobby. And for instance, Tzachi Hanegbi, who to begin with is more moderate than anyone there and was part of Kadima in the past. So Tzachi Hanegbi was elected from these votes to where he got from the new Likudniks. They gave him his power, they gave him his place, so it might prompt him and other Likudniks who enjoyed this support to adopt more moderate ideas also on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, so just before we go, I have to ask one last question. We got the cameras rolling. People are listening live. I got to get you on the, you know what's coming. Ehud, what's the outcome Tuesday?
I think most likely Bibi will be the next Prime Minister for a while, a short while maybe.
Tal, what's your view?
I'm really reluctant to do this, but I agree. It's probably as it seems now, it's probably most likely that it's Netanyahu.
David?
I tend to agree that, with all the variables, caveats, that it looks like he ekes out a narrow victory. But I have faith in the Israeli legal institutions. They're a lot stronger. We didn't really have a chance to discuss this here because we were focused on the elections and the like, but the Israeli legal system is very strong, and I tend to believe that ultimately, if they believe that this prime minister is going to go to trial, he will go to trial, and it could be therefore a short-term leadership. It could be only a year, whatever it is, but I would not underestimate the vitality, the vibrancy of the Israeli legal system.
All right. Well, there you have it. Please tune in to our post-election analysis. You'll be reading on Wednesday and hearing more in the days that follow just how right or not right our prognostications were. And I really want to thank all of you for participating in this fantastic discussion about the upcoming Israeli elections. Thank you. Ehud, Tal, David, well done.